The world did not change because a single raid happened in Venezuela. It changed because of what that raid signaled. On January 3, the United States did more than remove Nicolas Maduro. It reminded the world of an older rule, a rule many thought had been buried after 2 world wars and the Holocaust. The rule that says power decides, not law, not institutions, not norms, power. I want you to pause on that idea, because once a great power openly embraces it, the consequences travel far beyond one country, one leader, or one operation. For decades, the United States claimed its strength came not just from force, but from restraint, from rules that bound others and, at times, itself. That assumption may no longer hold. If you want to understand the next decade of global politics, this is the moment to pay attention. Stay with me. Because to grasp where we are going, we first need to be clear about what question this moment is forcing the world to confront. The real question is not whether the United States can act this way. It is whether it should and what happens once it does. For much of the post-war era, American power rested on a paradox. The United States was strongest when it chose to operate inside a system of rules. Those rules were imperfect. They constrained Washington at times, but they constrained rivals even more. That logic is now under strain. When senior officials argue that the world is governed by iron laws, by force, by strength, by power, they are not merely describing reality. They are redefining legitimacy. They are saying that restraint is optional and that virtue follows victory. Most Americans do not feel this shift as a loss. Few mourn the destruction of an adversary's nuclear facility. Few protest the removal of a hostile leader. Power, after all, feels righteous when it works. But systems do not collapse in moments of triumph. They erode quietly when exceptions become habits. To understand how we arrived here, we need to step back away from today's headlines and look at the longer arc that shaped this order in the first place. For most of human history, power really did make right. Empires expanded, borders shifted. The strong imposed order on the weak, and the cost was measured in generations. The 20th century broke that illusion twice. 2 world wars devastated entire continents. The Holocaust exposed what happens when power is unmoored from restraint. Out of that wreckage emerged a deliberate choice to replace raw force with rules. The post-war system was not born of idealism. It was born of fear. Fear of what unchecked power had already done. The United States did not abandon strength. It embedded strength inside institutions, alliances, and norms. NATO, security agreements, international law, not because they were nice, but because they made American power sustainable and predictable. Over time, that system shaped behavior. Violations were condemned. Aggression carried costs. Even great powers felt pressure to justify themselves. That is the inheritance now being questioned. Not because the system failed entirely, but because power, once again, is being asked to stand on its own. And when that happens, history suggests the first cracks appear not where you expect, but where power seems easiest to use. That is why Venezuela mattered more than it appeared. The January 3 operation was swift, decisive, and effective. From a tactical standpoint, it worked. Maduro was removed. Resistance collapsed. Power delivered results. But crises are not defined by what they achieve in the moment. They are defined by what they normalize. This was not framed as collective enforcement, not as multilateral action, not as a reluctant last resort inside a shared system. It was framed as necessity because strength allowed it. And that distinction matters. When power acts without reference to rules, it teaches a lesson, not just to adversaries, but to everyone watching. It says outcomes justify methods. That legality follows capability. Most Americans felt relief, even pride. Why shouldn't they? The operation removed a hostile leader and avoided a prolonged conflict. But systems remember what publics forget. Precedents accumulate, and once force becomes self-justifying, restraint stops being a principle and becomes a choice. If you're finding this uncomfortable, that's the point. Moments like this are easy to celebrate and hard to unwind. And as consequential as Venezuela was, it may not be the real test. Because the next challenge to this order is quieter, colder, and unfolding far from any battlefield. To understand why, You have to look beneath the headlines, into the mechanism now taking shape. Power does not just act, it teaches. When a dominant state decides that rules are optional, it creates what strategists call a permission structure. Others learn what is allowed not from speeches, but from behavior, from what is done and what goes unanswered. For years, the rules-based order worked less because it was perfect, and more because it was reinforced. Violations were named, aggressors were isolated. Even rivals felt the need to justify themselves. That dynamic is changing. If strength alone defines legitimacy, then every major power becomes its own judge. Interests replace norms, spheres of influence harden, and cooperation gives way to calculation. This is not theoretical, it is cumulative. When power is detached from restraint, alliances weaken, trust erodes. Partners start planning not around shared rules, but around worst-case scenarios. And once that happens, the system stops shaping behavior. Behavior reshapes the system. The danger is not chaos overnight. It is normalization over time. A world where unilateral action feels reasonable until it is used against you. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because the next test of this logic is not in a collapsing state, but in one of America's closest alliances. Greenland should never have been controversial, and that is precisely why it matters. No tanks, no invasion, just the suggestion that ownership by force or coercion was imaginable. On paper, Greenland offers little. It is vast, frozen, sparsely populated. Its infrastructure is thin. Its economy depends on subsidies. This is not a prize that makes a nation rich. And yet, the idea of taking it changed everything. Because Greenland is not Venezuela. It belongs to allies, to Denmark, to NATO. The strategic logic is obvious. Arctic routes, surveillance, submarine traffic. As ice melts, geography returns as destiny. But here is the crisis. None of that requires ownership. The United States already has access, already has agreements, already has willing partners. So when power speaks of possession anyway, it stops being strategic and becomes symbolic. A signal that even allies are not shielded by rules, only by leverage. Europe heard that message clearly. Capitals began recalculating, not out of panic but out of realism. Because if rules do not protect friends, they protect no one. This is the quiet moment where an order fractures, not through violence but through doubt. And once doubt enters an alliance, the effects do not stay local. They travel straight into the lives of ordinary people. When systems shift, they do not announce themselves to you as theory. They show up as uncertainty. You feel it when alliances feel less solid, when rules feel negotiable, when power, not predictability, becomes the organizing principle of the world you live in. You may never think about Greenland or Venezuela in your daily life, but you think about stability, about prices, about safety, about whether tomorrow looks roughly like today. A rules-based order lowers the temperature of the world. It makes outcomes boring, and boring, in geopolitics, is a luxury. When power replaces rules, volatility replaces trust. Markets react faster, conflicts escalate quicker, and small miscalculations carry larger consequences. You are told this is about strength, about decisiveness, about winning. But strength without restraint is expensive. It demands constant attention, constant dominance, constant proof, and eventually, someone always tests it. If you've felt the world becoming more anxious, more brittle, more unpredictable, this is part of why. If this perspective helps you see the bigger picture, pause for a moment. Share it. These conversations matter more than they seem, because the ripple effects don't stop with individuals. They reshape the balance of power itself. Once uncertainty spreads, it does not respect borders. It reorganizes the world. When the United States signals that power, not process, is the final arbiter, others listen carefully. Not to the rhetoric, but to the precedent. Allies begin to hedge. They diversify relationships. They invest in autonomy, not because they distrust America's intentions, but because intentions can change faster than geography. Adversaries see something else. Opportunity. Russia has long argued that security is defined by spheres of influence. China has tested the margins of the system through pressure that stays just below open conflict. Gray zones, ambiguity, incremental moves. Before, these actions triggered condemnation, sanctions, isolation, a reaffirmation of rules. Now the signal is muddled. If unilateral action is justified by national interest, why shouldn't others do the same, especially in regions they consider vital? Ukraine, Taiwan, the South China Sea. This is how global orders unravel, not through a single collapse, but through imitation. The irony is sharp. A doctrine meant to project strength can end up multiplying challenges by inviting every major power to test how far it can go. And once that happens, the question is no longer who is right, it is who is ready. So where does this path lead? There are three plausible futures, and none of them are abstract. In the best case, power rediscovers discipline. Strength is exercised, but selectively. Rules bend, but do not break. Allies adapt. Institutions survive. And the system evolves without collapsing. The world becomes rougher but still recognizable. In the middle scenario, ambiguity hardens. Unilateral actions multiply. Alliances thin but do not shatter. Great powers operate with fewer constraints, testing limits in gray zones. Crises become more frequent, more dangerous, yet narrowly contained. Stability exists, but only at the edge of tension. And then there is the worst case. The one history warns us about. Power fully detaches from legitimacy. Every major actor becomes judge and enforcer of its own interests. Spheres of influence replace shared norms. Small conflicts cascade, misjudgments compound. In that world, strength is no longer a deterrent, it is a magnet. Because when rules disappear, the only way to stay safe is to be stronger than everyone else. That is the paradox at the heart of this moment. A doctrine built on might promises control but risks a world that demands constant confrontation. And that brings us back to the country at the center of all this. Because the final test is not external. It is whether power itself can still sustain the system it now dominates. Power, in the end, is not just something you wield. It is something you must maintain. For 80 years, American strength was not sustained by force alone. It was sustained by an economy that outperformed, by alliances that multiplied influence, by institutions that attracted capital, talent, and trust, by the rule of law that made the United States predictable even when it was dominant. That foundation is easy to take for granted, and easy to weaken. If we enter a world where might makes right, then might has to be constantly renewed, through innovation, through alliances that still believe in you, through fiscal discipline, research, and credibility at home. Because power that confuses itself with virtue eventually overreaches, and power that neglects its own foundations slowly drains away. The real question, then, is not whether the United States can impose its will today. It is whether it can still shape the world tomorrow without standing alone. If this analysis made you see the moment differently, don't let it end here. Share it. Question it. Stay curious. Because the next chapter of this story is already being written. And understanding the system is the first step toward understanding your place within it.